Good evening. I'm David Kataforis, professor and chair of art history at the University of Kansas. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This acknowledgement recognizes Native Americans as traditional guardians of this land and the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 5th lecture in our series, Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The series asks, what constitutes identity? How do people navigate, form, and reform their sense of self? And how can the study of art and its history help us to consider the diverse identities expressed by visual culture and its creators? We seek to amplify the voices of scholars and artists whose work explores individual and collective identities as those intersect with notions of the body, disability, gender, heritage, and race. This series is organized by KU's Crest Foundation Department of Art History and our History of Art graduate students' Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. It is sponsored by the Franklin Murphy Lecture Fund. We present it in partnership with the Spencer Museum of Art, KU Department of Visual Art, Lawrence Arts Center, Lawrence Public Library, Raven Bookstore, and other community partners. The graduate students and I want to thank Art History Department Office Manager Lisa Clore for all of her organizational help and acknowledge the creator of the poster for this evening's lecture, KU student Olivia Michka. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Keri Watson, who is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Central Florida in the School of Visual Arts and Design. She earned her BA in Interdisciplinary Humanities from the University of West Florida and her MA and PhD in Art History from Florida State University. Her previous experience includes teaching positions at Savannah College of Art and Design, Atlanta, Auburn University at Montgomery, and Ithaca College. Dr. Watson's research focuses on representations of race, gender, and disability in modern and contemporary art. And it has been supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fulbright Terra Foundation, and the Society for the Preservation of American Modernists. Her extensive list of publications includes peer-reviewed articles in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Museums and Social Issues, a Journal of Reflective Discourse, and Journal of Museum Education, and peer-reviewed book chapters in Art and Activism in the Age of Systemic Crisis, Aesthetic Resilience, and Disability in Art History. She is currently editing the Routledge Companion to Art and Disability with Thomas W. Hiles, and her book with Kedra Navaroli, This is America, Reviewing the Art of the United States, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Dr. Watson has also curated several exhibitions, published many exhibition catalogs and catalog essays, authored numerous non-peer-reviewed articles and essays, and has given over 80 invited lectures and papers at international, national, and regional conferences. She has done important service at every level of the profession, including her current role as the executive editor of Panorama, Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, and also very noteworthy is her service since 2019 as executive director of the Florida Prison Education Project, a UCF program that seeks to offer a high-quality undergraduate education to people who are incarcerated in Central Florida. Dr. Watson will bring together her scholarly and critical interests in gender, race, class, and disability in this evening's lecture, which will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by a member of the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. So please type your questions for Dr. Watson into the chat in YouTube, either during or immediately following her talk. And I'm now happy to turn the screen over to Keri Watson for her lecture, Dalí's Dream of Venus, Sex, Surrealism, and Eugenics at the 1939 World's Fair.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present this evening. I'm speaking to you today from Oviedo, Florida, which is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Timucua, Miccosukee, and Seminole nations. I pay respect to Timucua, Miccosukee, and Seminole peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the diaspora. Before I begin and share my screen, I'd also like to issue a content warning. This presentation contains images of nudity and references to sex, dismemberment, and bondage. A mashup of Antoni Gaudi's Casa Mila and Minx's Burlesque Theater, Dalí's Dream of Venus opened at the New York World's Fair on June 15, 1939. Designed by Salvador Dalí and located along the amusement zone's main promenade, the pavilion offered fairgoers the ultimate escape from the day-to-day, a surrealist tableau of sculpture, painting, and performance. Stuccoed in globs of white and pink plaster, draped in red velvet, and decorated with protruding crutches, disembodied arms, and headless mermaids, Dalí's Dream of Venus featured the continuous exhibition of semi-nude female performers. As a reviewer for The New Yorker exclaimed, quote, "One of the best sights on the Midway is the bewilderment of the cash customers in Dalí's Crazy Girl Show. They don't know whether to be angry, amused, or excited," close quote. What was the desired effect of Dalí's spectacle? How did the performances he orchestrated shape audiences' understanding of contemporary art, leisure, and spectatorship? And how did arousal contribute to the process of turning female bodies into mediated objects at the 1939 New York World's Fair? Scholars who have explored Dalí's Dream of Venus have described it as making manifest the contradictions and compromises that surrealists brought with them to American shores. Curator Ingrid Schaffner proposed that it offered viewers an episode of inspired insanity, whereas art historian Lure Katcher declared that it epitomized the ways in which true surrealism gave way to popular entertainment in the US. What has not been examined is the ways in which Dalí's Dream of Venus combined sex, surrealism, and disability to support white, male, able-bodied heteronormativity. Disability is often conflated with gender, race, and class, and as theorized by disability studies scholars David T. Mitchell and Sharon L. Snyder, acts as a crutch upon which literary narratives lean for their representational power, disruptive potentiality, and analytical insight. This presentation extends their premise to the study of visual artwork and examines the ways in which Dalí's Dream of Venus orchestrated performances of disability, gender, race, and class to create moments of rupture and arousal. Drawing upon disability studies scholar Leonard J. Davis's argument that representations of Venus are best interpreted as attempts by male artists and critics to gird themselves against the irrationality and chaos of the body, I contend that Dalí's appropriation of classical representations of Venus both complemented and subverted the fair's decorative program of idealized figurative sculpture. His pavilion's iconography mobilized female bodies, live, sculpted, and painted, to personify Freudian castration anxieties, reassure visitors' able-bodied positionalities, and provide a safe space for the voyeuristic exploration of heterosexual desire. Furthermore, his generous borrowing of tropes from the sideshow and the burlesque theater allowed for the containment and disabling of working-class female bodies. Ultimately, I conclude that Dalí's dream of Venus depended upon the hypersexualized and prostheticized female body to arouse voyeuristic male spectators, embody the male anxiety evoked by women in disability, and expose the ways in which gender, race, and class and disability intersected during the 1930s. So part one will be mythology, idealized bodies, and eugenics. The 1939 New York World's Fair attracted over 44 million attendees who came to see exhibits ranging from Norman Bell Geddes' Futurama to Henry Dreyfuss's Democracy, each of which promised an idealized look at the world of tomorrow. The future imagined by the fair's organizers was made possible by advances in transportation, communication, and living standards, and was underscored by the belief that the United States would evolve into an ethnically homogeneous, socially inhabited society inhabited by, quote, typical Americans living in nuclear families. As art historian Christina Cogdell and historian Robert W. Rydell have demonstrated, the typical American family envisioned by the World's Fair organizers was conceptualized as able-bodied, native-born, white, and informed by eugenics, a social, political, and scientific movement that emerged in the United States during the late 19th century, gained momentum during the Progressive Era, and reached its peak of popular influence during the 1920s and 1930s. Evidencing the hegemony of white heteronormativity at the 1939 New York World's Fair, the Ford Motor Company and Federal Housing Administration co-sponsored a typical American families contest that provided 48 native-born, white, able-bodied winners with a new car and a free trip to the fair. And the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company sponsored an art contest in which Albert Wine's family group, comprised of an idealized Anglo-American man, woman, and child, received honorable mention. Excuse me. From displays that showcased streamlined consumer products and emphasized the ways in which standardized labor increased efficiency, to dioramas of a future perfected through social engineering, the 1939 New York World's Fair cultivated an environment in which bodies were measured and policed, and its sculptural decoration perpetuated capitalism's privileging of able bodies, or what disability studies scholar Robert McClure calls compulsory able-bodiedness. Compulsory able-bodiedness, a system that is intricately bound up with what feminist theorist Adrienne Rich conceptualized as compulsory heterosexuality, naturalizes and normalizes white, heterosexual, able bodies and constructs non-white, queer, and disabled bodies as inferior and unnatural. As I will show, notions of compulsory able-bodiedness and eugenics informed the style, subject, and reception of the fair's sculptural program, which ultimately served to naturalize the American body politic as white, male, heterosexual, and able-bodied, and to situate women, people of color, and people with disabilities as hypersexualized, abject, and other. The fair's ideological agenda of eugenic and technological progress was visualized in dozens of sculptures scattered throughout the fairgrounds, the majority of which monumentalized the idealized bodies of classical mythology in white plaster, marching boldly into a scientifically enhanced future. Despite worldwide economic depression and growing apprehension of fascism in Germany and Italy, the fair's sculptural program consistently called upon classical mythological figures depicted in a futuristic and streamlined style to embody the fair's tagline, "The World of Tomorrow." As contemporary art critic Elizabeth McCausland noted, quote, "An almost universal reliance on a mythological vocabulary and a representational manner of design," close quote, marked the decorative program of the 1939 New York World's Fair. In white plaster, John Gregory's monumental Four Victories of Peace depicted sleek archaic goddesses standing solidly together and offering visitors symbols of abundance: wheat, the wheel, wings, and wisdom. Paul Manship's aerodynamic and allegorical bronze statues, The Moods of Time, visualized Apollo carrying the sun across the sky and Venus basking in the moon's glow. exhibiting the Greco-Deco style, one that blended the linear precision and stiffness of ancient Greece with the smooth contours of Art Deco. These sculptures reminded the thousands of visitors who saw them daily of the beauty and perfection of the future as guaranteed through scientific and social engineering. From Carl Mielis's The Astronomer, a 30-foot tall white plaster sculpture of a modern-day atlas holding a model of the planet Earth in the palm of his hand, to Leo Lintelli's Golden Sprays, two 11 feet tall white plaster and gold leaf embellished classically inspired Venuses, represented an exaggerated contrapposto that celebrated beauty and athleticism. The fair's sculptural program relied on smooth white surfaces, crisply incised linear details, and idealized forms borrowed from ancient Greece and Rome, but updated for a modern viewer. As art historian Faye Brower notes, during the 1930s, quote, the body became inscribed as the prime site of delectation through interrelationships forged between art and visual cultures, modern medicine, science, anatomy, anthropology, anthropometry, criminology, and eugenics, close quote. The fair's extensive employment of mythological bodies was ideologically weighted, as eugenicists regularly employed the classical body to illustrate their belief that physical beauty indicated superior health and intellect. For instance, the 1924 bestseller, The Fruit of the Family Tree, argued that if, quote, men and women should select mates solely for beauty, it would increase all the other good qualities of the race, close quote. Going even further, in his address to the Second National Conference on Race Betterment, director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, J.H. Kellogg, argued that the world needed a, quote, real aristocracy made up of Apollos and Venuses and their fortunate progeny, close quote. Perhaps the fair's most startling visualization of this ideology was found in Gaetano Sierro's 25-foot tall, Arno Breker-esque white plaster sculpture, American Manhood, a modern-day Apollo, which adorned the entrance to the home furnishings building and depicted an idealized man with a greyhound by his side. A conflation of eugenic ideals and modern design, American Manhood, with its smooth white surfaces, linear musculature, and Anglo-American facial features, embodied physical and intellectual perfection through, quote, good breeding, a concept understood by its companion piece, American Womanhood, which depicted a contemporary Venus holding the hand of a young boy marching into the future to claim his place as a leader in the eugenically constructed world of tomorrow. The fair's sculptural program visualized the myth of the typical American family and supported art historian Mary Kay Coffey's assertion that, quote, the classical body as the normative image of whiteness strengthened the conceptual link between whiteness, the national body, and physical fitness, close quote. This imagined body politic, however, ignored the lived experience of real people, as evidenced by the recently completed 1935-1936 National Health Survey, which found that 1 in 6 Americans had, quote, some chronic disease, orthopedic impairment, or serious defect of hearing or vision, close quote. Instead of acknowledging the embodied reality of hundreds of thousands of people, the fair's sculptural program, full of tall, well-muscled, white plaster bodies, reflected and reinforced the 1930s obsession with bodily perfection. With the exception of small displays hosted by the disabled American veterans of the World War, the National Association of the Deaf, and the New York Association for the Blind, as well as the people with dwarfism employed by Morris Guest for his popular Little Miracle Town, and those with extraordinary physical characteristics working in the Strange as It Seems freak show, the World Fair Corporation did not seem interested in employing or accommodating those with physical or cognitive impairments. Furthermore, the fair organizers charged the welfare department, which also dealt with, quote, inebriated guests, delinquent minors, and prostitutes, close quote, which with providing assistance to visitors with disabilities. It was even reported that visitors to the fair, quote, were afraid to shake hands with the blind workers. The 1939 New York World's Fair predates the passage of the American with Disabilities Act by 51 years, so little in the way of accommodations might be expected, but the neglect of any real consideration for the needs or desires of visitors with physical or cognitive impairments indicates the extent to which people with disabilities were excluded from the fair's conception of the world of tomorrow. Okay, so the second part is sex psychology and the avant-garde. Sorry, stay there for 1 minute. The development of eugenics as an ideology paralleled that of both psychoanalysis and the historical avant-garde, and situated artists, and the historical avant-garde, pardon me, which situated artists as the first of three sets of troops involved in guiding society towards utopia. Unified by their rebellion against the status quo and desire to create a better future, eugenicists, psychiatrists, and artists alike published articles and manifestos during the first few decades of the 20th century that argued for revolutions in the ways in which the human body and mind were understood and aesthetically represented. Attempting to provoke change in people's beliefs by bypassing the protective cocoon of logic to penetrate more deeply into their psyches, as one modernist said, eugenicists, psychiatrists, and avant-garde artists challenged mainstream assumptions about identity, the body, and the formation of self. As Caroline Evans notes, although the avant-garde had a vested interest in the dissolution of the self, it did not have a monopoly on it. At the same time, other conservative discourses, such as criminology and psychiatry, which amounted to a social hygiene movement, also reformulated questions of identity, close quote. Sigmund Freud believed in phylogenetic memory, a eugenic theory that stated that acquired characteristics were inherited, and Dalí conceived of himself as a visionary who tapped into the collective unconscious to create startling art that would move the world toward a liberated utopia. As Dalí wrote, any individual gifted with a sufficient degree of paranoia can, according to his desire, see the form of an object taken from reality change successively, excuse me, close quote. The Freudian psychology that Dalí depended upon in the formulation of his evolutionary informed surrealist dream would have been legible to contemporary American audiences familiar with Freud through the influential writer and father of American psychology, William James, and the popularity of Dale Carnegie's best-selling self-help book, How to Win Friends and Influence People of 1936. Freud visited the United States and helped create the American Psychoanalytic Association in 1911. And by the 1930s, psychoanalytic institutes had been established in every major American city, from New York to Chicago, Boston, and Baltimore. Freudian psychoanalytic themes were visualized for American audiences by exhibitions of surrealist art at the Brooklyn Museum in 1926, the Wadsworth Atheneum in 1931, and both the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 1936. Popular newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, New Yorker, Newsweek, and Life, regularly covered the Surrealist movement and remarked on its compelling visualizations of Freudian principles. Dalí's popularity and status as an avant-garde artist, and he graced the cover of Time magazine in 1936, made him an ideal contributor to the 1939 New York World's Fair. And the iconography of Dalí's Dream of Venus, which adhered perfectly to the fair's mythological theme by including numerous representations of Venus in her many guises, was secured by gallerist Julian Levy, but generated by Dalí's paranoid critical method. Dalí's technique, developed during the 1930s as a way of inducing a paranoid hallucinogenic state, recording it visually and then establishing connections between seemingly unrelated concepts or images, was influenced by Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams and resembled Freud's method of free association. While in a paranoid critical state, Dalí supposedly drew his unfiltered thoughts as they came to him, thereby creating startling juxtapositions resurrected from his unconscious. The result, Dalí's Dream of Venus, performed quite literal reenactments of Freudian psychoanalysis. Women swam in a fishbowl surrounded by floating objects of free association. A nude Venus slept on a 36-foot-long bed beneath a mirror, while her dreams were visualized as a large-scale version of Dalí's The Persistence of Memory, itself a visualization of phylogenetic memory. a male mannequin with a bird cage for a torso, a pastiche of René Magritte's The Therapist of 1937, set at the foot of Venus's bed, presumably analyzing her dreams, and a life-size papier-mâché man leopard covered in shot glasses, which was also a recasting of Dalí's aphrodisiac jacket of 1936, and a visualization of latent sexual desire, all stood watch nearby. Visitors experienced this pastiche of art and psychotherapy in 3 dimensions as they walked through Dalí's funhouse-like pavilion. Dalí's physical enactment and embodiment of psychoanalytic theory called specifically upon the Oedipus complex and its associated castration anxiety to convey meaning. In Freud's theory of castration anxiety, as elucidated in Beyond the Pleasure Principle of 1920, the Oedipus complex is characterized by a death wish for one's father and erotic desires for one's mother, and develops out of the fear that the father will destroy the child's phallus. Fittingly, Venus is frequently associated with the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety in her various roles as daughter, lover, and mother. She is simultaneously the daughter of Jupiter, the chief Roman deity and god of the sky and thunder, and born of the sea foam emitted from the castrated testicles of Caelus, a sky god who had been disabled and made impotent by his son Saturn, a god of generation who not only cut off his father's testicles and threw them into the ocean, but also devoured his own children out of fear that they would then castrate him. Venus is the consort of numerous mortal men and gods, including Mars, the god of war, Vulcan, the god of fire, and Jupiter, the god of the sky, and also her father. And she is the mother of Cupid, the god of love, Hermaphroditus, the god of hermaphrodites and effeminates, and Priapus, god of fertility, known for his exceptionally large and permanently erect phallus. She is even imbricated in the castration anxieties of Psyche, her son Cupid's lover. Venus is connected to eugenic ideals and notions of disability as well. Freud viewed castration as, quote, the formulation for the cultural construction of disabled bodies as lacking, close quote, and as Davis notes, quote, the Venus tradition involves castration at its very origin and is based on the idea of mutilation, fragmented bodies, decapitation, and amputation, close quote. From the armless Venus de Milo to the headless and armless Nike of Samothrace, the broken body of Venus has come to represent beauty, perfection, and ironically, wholeness, even though a number of recovered antique sculptures of goddesses are headless, armless, or otherwise amputated. While statues of gods come down to us in fragments as well, the proportion of effaced statues of goddesses is higher, leading Davis to posit that, quote, Vandals, warriors, and adolescent males amused themselves by committing focused acts of violence, of sexual bravado and mockery on these embodiments of desire, close quote. In addition then to serving as what we might call early sex toys, classical sculpture was consistently employed by eugenicists to represent the physical manifestation of their principles. And Venus, as the goddess of love, sex, beauty, and fertility, made an ideal symbol for their movement. As I will show, Dalí's dream of Venus exploited Venus's multiple positionalities to construct her simultaneously as a hypersexualized eugenic ideal, a symbol of disability, and a synecdoche for both liminal desire and castration anxiety. Okay, part 3, Venus in her many guises. Like the rest of the fair's idealized sculptures, Dalí's pavilion consistently called upon Venus as a symbol of ideal beauty. On the exterior of the pavilion, a 25-foot-tall photostat enlargement of the central Venus figure from Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus was pasted above the entryway, and living incarnations of Venus, played by young female models clothed in gold and turquoise bathing suits, posing above the doorway, formed living pedimental sculptures and called out to passersby like Homeric sirens. A niche on the side of the pavilion was plastered with an enlarged print of Leonardo da Vinci's St. John the Baptist with the face of the Mona Lisa collaged onto it. And inside, another living Venus, in imitation of Giorgione and Titian's Sleeping Venus, reclined on a bed covered in white and red satin, adorned with flowers and ivy. Models dressed in corsets, fishnet stockings, and garters played the roles of Venus's attendants, sea nymphs swimming in a room-sized aquarium filled with typewriters and telephone receivers, perhaps an allusion to Peter Paul Rubens' Nereids lamenting the dead body of Leander, in which sea nymphs mourn the death of Leander by calling out to Venus after she drowned Leander to prevent him from rendezvousing with one of her virgin priestesses. Updated for a modern audience, Dalí's Nereids use modern-day telephones as they engage in a fruitless reenactment of grief and frustrated desire. Taken together, Dalí's appropriation of Botticelli and Leonardo on the exterior of the pavilion and restaging of Giorgione, Titian, and Rubens in its interior situated him within the history of classical and Renaissance art and complemented the wider fair's mythological and technological themes. At the same time, Dalí's many Venuses were called the fragmented bodies of classical sculpture and engaged with the anxiety that surrounded physical disability between the world wars. As national, political, and economic tensions mounted during the 1930s, many feared a Second World War was imminent, and the physical traumas, including death and dismemberment, that marked the Great War were still evident in the prosthesis-adorned bodies of actual war veterans. This, coupled with an economic depression that led many women to join the workforce, created a scenario in which the double threat of castration, the fear of the loss of bodily integrity via war, and the loss of economic use value via unemployment, penetrated the daily lives of men. At once a eugenic ideal and the embodiment of castration anxiety and disability, Venus provided an ideal symbol of male anxiety over war, women's suffrage, and the Great Depression. Reassuring male dominance and physical virility, Dalí's dream of Venus assuaged masculine castration anxiety by removing the female emasculating threat and returning the working class female body to the confined space of sexual spectacle. Beyond simply alluding to disability or interrogating the stability of the Venus figure as symbol of wholeness and aesthetic integrity, however, Dalí literally disabled many of his pavilion's female bodies. He sculpted mythological mermaids and echidnas without heads. He decorated the pavilion with amputated arms and crutches. He created columns out of disembodied legs. He cut Botticelli's Venus out of her painting and collaged her onto the exterior of the building. And he pasted the face of La Conjonda onto a man's body. Whereas the fair's primary sculptural program celebrated idealized bodies, Dalí's pavilion dismembered and prostheticized them as a means of containing female sexuality. This disabling and reconstructing was emphasized through costuming. Dalí's Venuses were dressed in transparent lace-up corsets, red mesh halter tops that suggested the silhouette of lobster's claws, and crimson hairnets that evoked their imminent capture. Corseted in these shell-like costumes, the female working-class bodies of Dalí's dream were restricted, tied up, and kept in bondage as hypersexualized lobster women who both embodied and reassured the male fears of castration, impotence, and disability. As art historian Nancy Fraser puts it, quote, "The lobster threat was correlated not only with acts of emasculation of the son by the father, but also with female envy of male genitals," close quote. And she's talking about his lobster telephone in this case, but he was kind of obsessed with lobsters. The female lobster, a sea creature whose exoskeleton operates as protective prosthesis, must shed her shell and move into a male lobster's habitat to mate. During the 2 weeks that lapse between mating and the regrowth of her shell, the female lobster is trapped in the male's cave, vulnerable to death and dismemberment by her partner. Discourses on sexuality often support the normative image of sexuality as heterosexual, reproductive, and above all, autonomous. But as Michel Foucault notes, quote, "discipline sometimes requires enclosure." Okay. By visualizing Venus as a lobster trapped in a tank with an armored shell and prosthetic pincers, Dalí simultaneously repaired the goddess's disfigured body and rendered her dependent on an imagined and potentially dangerous male lover spectator. Surrealists were obsessed with the body as armor, which they saw, quote, as a prosthesis that served to shore up the disrupted body image or to support a ruined ego construction, close quote. Prostheses, whether literal or metaphorical, are developed to solve the, quote, problem the disability poses to society, close quote. And Dalí's use of prosthesis confirms his interest in fixing and containing the female body, a body that once arouses and threatens male heterosexuality. To make clear the connotation, visitors entered Dalí's cave-like pavilion by passing between monumental columns sculpted to resemble a woman's disembodied legs. In this way, the audience physically enacted a return to the womb, whereby they confronted their insecurities through simulated psychoanalysis, witnessed the disabling of Venus and her containment through prosthesis, and were reborn, reassured of their hegemony as white, able-bodied heterosexual men through their voyeuristic consumption of the erotic spectacle of female dismemberment. And part 3, Dalí's burlesque freak show. Composed of undulating lines and sea motifs, Dalí's dream of Venus appeared to play id to the fair's ego, but I contend that its pastiche of the fair's mythological and eugenics symbols actually reinforced normative gender roles by providing a socially acceptable space for the voyeuristic containment and consumption of sublimated sexual desire. To achieve this aesthetic sleight of hand, Dalí borrowed tropes from the lowbrow popular entertainments of the sideshow and burlesque theater. Dalí's dream of Venus was pitched to the World's Fair Planning Committee as, quote, an old-type funny house, but with each attraction translated into terms of surrealism, close quote. And it made ample use of mirrors, mazes, and masquerades to distort conventional perceptions and startle unaware viewers. Following the tradition of sideshow carnival barkers, swimsuit-clad models stood above the entrance, called out to passersby and held bamboo fishing rods to reel in customers. Dalí's use of topless performers and live swimming showgirls, he employed 17 working-class white women, even led critics to compare it to a burlesque nudie tank show. And by costuming his models to resemble lobster-inspired sea nymphs, Dalí referenced both burlesque nudity and his own artistic oeuvre, and enfreaked them to resemble sideshow performers. Specifically, Dalí's lobster women recalled the popular Lobster Family, a group of sideshow performers with ectrodactyly, a condition in which the fingers and toes are fused together to form what was viewed as claw-like extremities. And his headless mermaids reference the sideshow's interest in hybrid animal-human acts, such as the headless woman and miraculous mermaid. The Venus theme often was associated with both the sideshow and burlesque as well. Saartjie Baartman was forcibly exhibited at Piccadilly Circus as the Hottentot Venus during the late 19th century. The armless sideshow performer Frances O'Connor was billed as the living Venus de Milo in Todd Browning's classic 1932 film Freaks, and Venus in a Clamshell was a popular act at Minsky's Burlesque Theater. Minsky's, don't know what I just said, sorry. Following the sideshow's interest in transgender performers, Josephine Joseph being among the most popular, and the burlesque's pansy craze of the 1930s, during which female impersonators, known as, quote, pansy performers, experienced a surge in popularity in Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. The exterior of Dalí's Dream of Venus included a photostat of Leonardo da Vinci's St. John the Baptist, with the face of the Mona Lisa collaged onto it. Already an androgynous figure in Leonardo's painting, St. John the Baptist was transformed by Dalí into a drag performer masquerading as La Gioconda. St. John's muscular arm recalled sideshow strongmen, and the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile kept viewers guessing in this burlesque sideshow performance of gender and sexuality. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, Dalí's Dream of Venus was not located in or near the Contemporary Arts Pavilion, but in the Great White Way, as the amusement zone was called, an area of the fair that fulfilled the role of the sideshow and presented visitors with everything from the strange as it seems freak show, complete with bearded lady, Petrified Man, Lobster Family, and Pygmies from Batwa, to Billy Rowe's Aquacade, a display of hundreds of synchronized swimmers and high dive acts. Dalí's Dream of Venus, like these other lowbrow spectacles, simultaneously titillated and reassured viewers, while underscoring the narrative of civilization and progress, the ideological underpinnings of both eugenics and the 1939 New York World's Fair that maintained the audience members' position of privilege. Dalí's generous borrowing of tropes from the sideshow and burlesque allowed for the display and disabling of working class female bodies, and his appropriation of the classical trope of Venus, with its connotations of high art and eugenics, fit well within the fair's larger mythological decorative motif. Although Dalí's Dream of Venus may at first appear to upend normative expectations, it blended high and lowbrow culture and combined sex, surrealism, and disability to reassure white, able-bodied male visitors of their privileged positionality and provide a societally sanctioned space for the voyeuristic exploration of heterosexual desire. Venus is often employed to titillate and control, and I hope this presentation has shown how Dalí's Dream of Venus depended upon the hypersexualized and prostheticized female body to arouse voyeuristic male spectators, embody the male anxiety evoked by women in disability during the interwar period, and expose the ways in which class, gender, and disability are conflated in art and popular culture. During the 1930s, evolutionary theory formed the ideological foundation upon which modernists in almost every field constructed their work, arguments, and perceptions. And although aesthetically different, the embodied identities performed by Dalí's Dream of Venus and displayed in the fair's decorative program each demonstrated the pervasiveness of racialized able-bodied bias at the 1939 New York World's Fair. With its interest in classical figuration, sexual desire, prosthetics, and body entertainment, Dalí's Dream of Venus translated surrealism into an art style that was easily understood by American audiences. And rather than a radical rethinking of normative heterosexual desire, it consistently offered up a reinforcement of castration anxiety through the glorification of the fetish object, the disabled working class female body. Perhaps this, more than anything else, helps to explain Dalí's mass appeal and enduring popularity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. If we were live, you'd be hearing applause. So everybody can use the little clap emoji on Zoom.
Thank you.
Dr. Watson, thank you so much. What an important lecture, how informative, and I'm just marveling at the range of visual materials you brought in for us to see. I'm excited to go back to the recording of this lecture and look at each of your slides and pause.
Thank you.
So a number of questions for you in the Q&A so far. So one person has asked, are there any accounts left by viewers and visitors to the fair, and specifically the reception of Dalí's Dream of Venus?
Yes, there are articles in Life magazine and other newspapers and daily periodicals. People wrote in and remarked about lots of aspects of the fair, including the Dream of Venus. It was not incredibly popular. It was not very much a success. And after the first season, it was revamped and changed around. And Dalí actually, if I recall correctly, he didn't even really stick around for the opening of the first year. So he kind of, put it all together and then hit the road. And so he was in New York anyway, though, to work with Julian Levy at the gallery, and also he's in New York for the famous Bonwit Teller bathtub through the glass window incident, which is also, some theorize, a bit of a publicity stunt as well for the gallery and for this event that he has at the fair. So.
Thank you for that. And I'm curious myself, I want to add to this. Is there any sort of surviving discourse from veterans, from pre-ADA accessibility advocates? What is that conversation like, or what remains from that?
There are some historical accounts of I quoted a little bit there about people saying they were scared to shake hands with blind people. Eleanor Roosevelt, in her memoir and her letters, also wrote about going and seeing the blind display and meeting with some of the people with disabilities who were at the fair. There was, at the same time as this was happening, as in 1935, as the World Fair Planning Committee was meeting in New York City, the League of the Physically Handicapped was also meeting in New York City and had really the first demonstration ever demanding that the WPA hire people with disabilities. And it's actually in the WPA kind of guidebook that the eligibility was restricted to quote unquote able-bodied Americans who could work. And so that was a significant problem as well. And a group of people boycotted, and it led to 5,000 people being hired, not at the fair, but in the local New York City employment office through the WPA, but that only represented a small percentage of the actual people who had disabilities who wanted to work. The fair also got in trouble in its planning stages because it didn't hire African Americans, and there was a well-publicized picket, a strike that went on in order to demand that the fair hire people of color as well as white workers. So there was certainly a conversation surrounding the fair, and there were, as I mentioned, these few groups, right, advocacy groups that had, displays but not not as we would think of any kind of working towards accessibility or inclusivity. As a matter of fact, for the if you look at photos of the Trilon and the Perisphere, there's this large moving sidewalk, and people stood in line for hours. The whole fairgrounds was like 8 miles, and people all complained about how much their feet hurt and how hard it was to get around, and like able-bodied people complaining about how difficult the fair was. And some people also complained of vertigo when they were in Democracy, because you sat on this you stood on this small little balcony, and basically it like turned around and you were looking over this city. And Futurama, I think, was a little bit, could be a little, probably needed one of those strobe light warnings, right, that we get now.
Yeah. Wow, thank you for that. Just incredibly layered. And I'm curious about, is this something, I've read you write about ugly laws before, and I'm wondering if this is something that folks were subject to too? Or maybe if you could expound on that a little bit and then.
Yes, sure. Well, there were a whole series of ugly laws passed in the early 20th century that prevented people with physical disabilities from being seen in public. And that was part of also the League of the Physically Handicapped arguing for employment. We begin to see that go away after the Great War because so many war veterans came back as amputees. So in fact, in many ways, the dismemberments of World War I very much helped the larger disability rights movement because people who considered themselves quote unquote normal were much more sympathetic to war veterans than they might be to other people in society. So that helped the movement. And then I think in 1945, it might be 42, but you have the first national organization established for kind of disability rights advocacy work. And then, some of those laws are dismantled. But at the same time, you have, sterilization programs going on into the 70s. And actually, there was just a case in 2003 where the court said it was okay to sterilize a woman who was cognitively impaired. And so this is, that's not exactly the same thing as ugly laws, but this notion of preventing people from reproducing because of you've deemed whatever they are allowed to for whatever, because they meet whatever standards of society. Yeah. Oh, and then I guess I should say as well that in the 19th century we begin to see massive institutionalization, which continues through the 20th century until we get to deinstitutionalization. But then there are also problems with having kind of no medical system of support as well. So
still amazingly resonant today.
Yeah.
So let's see, someone has asked, several people saying how much they've enjoyed your lecture and thanking you. So someone has asked, could you please elaborate on the connection between class, performer, and fear of impending war?
Class, performer, and fear of impending war. I think maybe mentioning the part where I'm talking about kind of castration anxiety, the double castration anxiety of working women and dismemberment. Yeah. Yeah, I think you have massive unemployment, right, in the 30s, and this, people don't know yet that we're going to enter the war. So the United States, and the 1939 New York World's Fair is also just fascinating from that standpoint, right? Because you have country, in the regular part of the fair, not in the amusement zone, but the regular part, it's a world fair. So different countries have pavilions, right? And so some of these countries are dissolving after their pavilions are already being built because of the march up to the war that's happening. And we go to war during the second season of the fair, right? So anyway, so in the case of Dalí's Dream of Venus and the Billy's Aquacade and other areas of that part of the fair, Morris Guest's Little Town, you're employing primarily like lower working class, the women as the performers, right, as the dancers, kind of unrepresented. There's lots of great photos of them kind of in the back room getting ready and putting on their makeup and smoking cigarettes and behind the scenes. This is a total aside, but I'm in Orlando, and when we had first moved here, I remember going by, there's a big amusement park that is like Holy Land, and the back of Holy Land, like where the performers might be backstage, kind of like in the back of the building, you can see from one of the highways. And we drove by, and Jesus was out back smoking behind Holy Land, which I thought was, quite an interesting thing, which reminds me of these photographs. But anyway, so I think the families who go to the fair, the people who pay the price of admission and visit the fair, and then it costs more extra to go in some of these amusements in the amusement zone. So the people who are attending the fair are middle class, maybe upper middle class, and then you have more working class people, working the fair. So I think there's a class tension that's already existing there. But even with middle class America, with the Great Depression, you're looking at underemployment or unemployment. And so I do believe that there is a tension there, right? And this anxiety that many men were having at the time, I think many, let's say, white able-bodied men who maybe were not of age to be in World War I, right? So they're coming of age, there aren't as many jobs, but they felt that maybe they would have had jobs. They felt that they should have jobs. This is kind of reminding me of today right now. And then feeling that you're not, for whatever reason, right? Whether it is women who are taking the jobs, or today we want to say, undocumented workers taking the jobs, or whoever it is, this other group that is impeding on your ability to have what it is that you feel like you should have in the culture. And I guess if I were to maybe say my argument differently, maybe this type of amusement, Dalí's amusement, or even, hardcore pornography could be a way for people to deal with those anxieties and the frustrations I'm not saying necessarily a healthy way, but it fulfills some sort of sense of loss, right? So, and especially when you're talking about these women being, metaphorically dismembered, they're losing, right? They're being, they're suffering the loss rather than you. So there's this kind of projection of anxiety. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. I certainly think so. So switching gears a little bit, someone else has asked, and they thank you so much. Someone else has said that they are fascinated by World's Fairs. Yeah, truly, truly fascinating topic. And they've asked what drew you to this topic, and what advice do you have for researching a fair from an art historical point of view?
Wow. So I love World Fairs also. Starting with the Crystal Palace in 1851. I mean, they're just so fascinating. I think that in some ways, so I teach an Art of Walt Disney class, and I took an Art of Walt Disney class when I was in graduate school. And actually my first publication was on a Walt Disney Silly Symphony. And I think in some ways I've come to World Fairs through amusement parks, through theme parks really, not, and I've also, about 10, 15 years ago, I started working on the sideshow. So then Coney Island was kind of there. And so now you have Disney and Coney Island and amusement parks and theme parks, and they all are coming out of course, World Fairs. And at first I was interested in specifically like sideshow banners and the way bodies were constructed in that space. But I'm also interested in this notion, I think, of kind of a liminal space and not a real space. And it actually occurred to me recently. I remember that one of the first papers I wrote in undergraduate, like eons ago, in an English class was about roller coasters. And so who knew that this would be so fascinating to me? But yeah, I just think they're very interesting. Nationalism, a war, the way we construct and the competitions and the way art was exhibited. Of course, when you think about the 19th century and you think about Courbet or, the 1888 Paris World Fair. And I actually, I teach using a pedagogy called Reacting to the Past. And there's a game called Modernism versus Traditionalism, Art in Paris, 88, 89, that I have used for, I guess, maybe the past 10 years with my students. That the game culminates at the Universal exhibition. So yeah, I don't know. I've always been very interested in it. And then for the World Fairs in the 20th century, Robert Rydell has done amazing work on World Fairs. And Christina Cogdill, who I also mentioned, she does a lot on eugenics and World Fairs. She wrote about Dreyfus and democracy. And this fair is so, and the 33 fair too in Chicago is also fascinating. Oh my gosh, and I just forgot a big part of it. And I wrote my master's thesis on the women's building at the Columbian Exposition.
Also
in 1893. And my interest from that actually came from Devil in the White City, which, if no one's read The Devil in the White City, I highly recommend that. That book is kind of old now, but it's a great book too. So I don't know. And I'm also fascinated by the fact that they're so grand, but so temporary, right? That the buildings are just kind of made of plaster and the sculptures are made of plaster and then they're gone. And to try to imagine what it is to would have been to be there. When I was writing about the Columbian Exposition, I was reading like these period novels, and so it was, sell the cow, do whatever you have to do to get to the fair, and then that fair, like the 33 and the 39 Chicago and New York, coincided with depressions, economic depression. So that's very fascinating to me. And I did live in San Francisco for 6 years, and I actually worked in the Diego Rivera archives while I was there. And there is a huge mural at City College of San Francisco and at the Art Institute out in San Francisco that are murals he made for the fair, for the Pan Pacific Fair. And so, yeah, I guess Thank you so much to whoever asked that question, because I've obviously, you can tell, I've been making a lot of connections out loud as I'm answering the question. And
Yes, that was wonderful, KU grad student Kat White, and maybe with your permission, I can put you in touch by email.
oh, sure, I'd love to. Obviously, I'd love to talk about fairs more.
Yeah,
I'm
yes.
happy to. Yeah.
Mary Frances, can I jump in with a question? I know you have more in the chat, but
Please do.
Dr. Watson, I've seen somewhere some movie footage or motion picture footage of the performers in the Dream of Venus Pavilion. Do you want to address that aspect of how it was visually documented, or how that footage was used?
Yeah, and I actually just recently came across some of those videos on YouTube, and I've watched a few of them. Do you know why they were made, or who saw them?
Am I misremembering? Are they even in color? Am I misremembering that?
No, they're in color.
Right, which was a pretty new motion picture technology in the late 30s, right?
Definitely.
So maybe,
yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering if who made them, what they were made for. Were they, this is before television, so they would have potentially been screened in a theatrical setting. Anyway, maybe another layer of your research could explore the origins and the function of the moving picture documentation. Or was it not documentation? Was it made for some purpose of entertainment?
Well, so a lot of the scholarship on Dalí's Dream of Venus also talks about this kind of tension between what the fair organizers wanted and what he wanted and what it ended up being, and what it was called. And in fact, I pointed out on the map, because it's not on the map. It's not on any of the official maps that were made of the fairs. I think that the fair organizers were like, oh my God, because Julian Levy proposed it first, and he actually wanted it to be more like what they had done the year before in Paris, the exhibition that had like 24 surrealists, including like Duchamp was in that, and it had the Avenue of the Mannequins. So he was hoping to have like 5 surrealists and to do something bigger. And as it turned out, then Dalí was the only one that was interested or that he could get. And he kept, there were a lot of negotiations. At one, they even got this like rubber manufacturer to underwrite the cost of this rubber man that was in there, but then he had to be included, and Dalí was continuously not doing what people wanted him to do. But it also, much of it seemed like with the Bonwood Teller, it was probably all a publicity stunt, right? It probably wasn't that he was so furious that somebody took the fur coat off the mannequin in the bathtub, right? It increased sales. So none of his publicity stunts, though, really seemed to work so much at the fair. But it does, well, and there's, it was written up in Variety as well, which I didn't mention that scholarship. A lot of the color photographs that were taken, though, of like the behind the scenes and of the, inside, I think that when Schaffner published her book in 2002, which is called Salvador Dalí's Dream, many of those had just kind of been rediscovered. And I'm wondering if perhaps that video, the film, what it would have been like I don't even know. I was going to say Super 8, but no, that's not right. I don't, some old film kinetoscope thing from 1939. Perhaps that photographer, or perhaps it was even Levy. Or another promoter. That's a good avenue for future research to look more into the films of it.
Rachel Quist, member of the DEAI committee who you've met, Keri, wrote us that some footage of the display was included in more general promotional materials for the World's Fair. So I'm curious what Rachel knows that she can share. Well, let's see. Would love to hear any additional questions from our audience if they have any.
I think Rachel had a question before I jumped in. So the question above that.
Oh, yes, absolutely did. Forgive me. Okay. Rachel asks, Keri, if you could talk more about the eugenicist themes in the World's Fair and how those were received. Are there any records that survive?
Well, so it's really Cogdell and Rydell who have discussed the notion of eugenics at the fair writ large. So Christina Cogdell in Modern Design discusses, and maybe another book as well, Dreyfus, and there's some articles about Dreyfus actually being a eugenicist and this connection with democracy, and Geddes too with Futurama. Then Rydell also talks about typical American families and how that was structured, thinking about the fair as a whole. More of the research on genetics coincides with the Pan-Pacific Fair, because that was the fair where there was actually like a eugenics exhibit that went along with it that was by the ERO, right? And then also at the 1933 at the Chicago World's Fair, the ERO, the Eugenics Records Office, that's in Cold Springs, New York, that was underwritten by the Rockefeller Foundation, the ERO went and interviewed people at the 33 fair. So they specifically went to the, it wasn't called Morris Guest's Little Town, it was the Dwarf Village. I can't remember what they called it, but the display that was a city of little people. I think they called it something with little people. And they also interviewed and were measuring. I mean, they wanted to measure people, right? They wanted to measure them and measure their skulls and measure people in, like, there were also displays on midways and at world fairs that were specifically kind of ethnographic, anthropological. And then you also have, alongside with world fairs, all the state fairs had these eugenics displays, right? And you could get a medal, a better breeding medal. You could go and answer a series of questions. You could see how you sized up. And also at the 33 fair, in one of the science buildings, there was the display of the Calicax, and then compared to the Roosevelt. So they would do these in family trees of like prestigious families and not so prestigious families. So this is just one part, this Dalí part that you've got here. And I'm not a Dalí scholar, but my interest in this came from my larger interest in the eugenics and the sculpture. So people hadn't really written about these there were over 100, and McCausland writes about them, these towering white mythological sculptures as you walk through the fair. Now, there is an article that talks about modernism at the fair in murals, but the sculpture at the fair has not really received any attention, except for a little bit for the
Augusta Savage.
Thank you. The Augusta Savage gets some attention, but except for the Augusta Savage and one other plaster sculpture that was also painted black to kind of imitate bronze and to represent, that one was a like an enslaved figure, the other one, and maybe one Nubian sculpture, they called it. That was it, the Nubian slave. That and Augusta Savage's, all the rest of them are these white, mythological, idealized. And there's a lot of period literature talking about Apollos and Venuses. There was a New York Times article about people wanting to strive to be Apollos and Venuses. So that was really my kind of point of entry. And then I just, Dalí's kind of a challenge to myself to just be like, why don't you look at this crazy little thing that's going on over here?
So was Venus kind of the connector then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I mean, the larger theme was this Venus, and I was curious in that. So
yeah.
That's how I got there. I don't know if it hopefully it connected. But her more specific question was, she also asked about like kind of period response, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, so what I would say about eugenics generally is that many people in the 30s were kind of just naturally it was almost taken for granted. And I'll give the example of, our former president writing a book called Crippled America. So this, that many people read, and publicly mocking a journalist with disabilities, right? This notion, and we still have today, we have kind of designer babies and genome mapping and 23andMe and right, like we have all kinds of things that we can do on our, march towards Gattaca. But I don't think that it was not a strange phenomenon, right? It was pretty accepted, and in fact, most of as is well reported in the scholarship, Americans were, it wasn't just Germany, and then we started doing, we were really the ones who had these ideas that then were taken to this, extreme with the Holocaust, but we were doing a lot of this and continue to do a lot of this, and it was not like some big dark secret, I think is the other thing I would say. Yeah. I would say the normal, the naturalized perception was that yes, people with disabilities are totally, they shouldn't be having sex, they're not having sex, and they shouldn't have children, and why don't we just sterilize people or put people in an institution or, move over here. And the goal was to, there were articles about a master race, right? That we were all very teleological, right? That we as human beings get smarter and taller and better every year, right, with every generation, and we want our children to be better than us, and we are making all of these genetically modified foods that are then going to help us to do that, and to, right, that's not even that unusual from the discourse now. We don't say eugenics anymore, we just say genetics, right? But
yes, a lot of through lines with contemporary culture. And that brings me to a question from someone else who says, many representations and imagery of folks who are disabled continue to be deeply problematic and damaging. Were there any artists in the 20th century and or any today who you believe engage sensitively and thoughtfully with disability? This is a prime question for you. I know you've written extensively on disability and contemporary art.
Yeah, well, so Riva Lehrer is a very famous artist who investigates disability and in her own work. Petra Kuppers, there's also now becoming more interest in looking at community art collectives and co-ops that have artistic space. And so you're seeing also with this kind of breakdown of outsider insider art, right, that kind of a more inclusive art market that has more diverse representation and artists as well. I don't know why I'm like kind of blanking on names, but there have been several also very good exhibitions, and there's a DisArts Festival in Michigan every year. I guess probably not in the last 2 years, but traditionally there had been as well. And Alice Shepard, who's a performance artist, is really fantastic.
Will you remind me of the name of the dancer who died several years ago who wore prostheses on all 4 limbs?
Lisa Bufano.
Yeah.
Lisa Bufano. Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking as you were saying that really core to all of your responses has been that inclusivity and fostering belonging for disabled people has so much to do with breaking down these boundaries and bringing more people in. So one person asked, can you speak more about the Florida Prison Education Project? How does your role as an art historian impact the work you do as director of the Florida Prison Education Project?
Well, thank you for that question. So I taught an art history class at a men's prison in Alabama when I was at Auburn for the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. And when it was a really amazing experience to have done that. And when I came to UCF, I looked for a program in Florida that I could work with, and I couldn't find one. So I decided to start one. And so we were really, it was great to be designated a community challenge initiative by our administration at UCF. And we have now taught over 500 students. We teach a variety of classes. We had a big art exhibition last fall that included contemporary artists whose work engages with mass incarceration, and many of whom who had been incarcerated, as well as work by our incarcerated students that we had taught the year before. And we also published a chapbook of poetry and artwork by our incarcerated students. But we also teach we teach a physics class, we teach an American government class, we teach art history, theater. We do a variety of courses and general education courses to help people get their AA degree. And yeah, I guess it's interesting because Rebecca Ginsburg at University of Illinois is also an art historian, architectural historian, who she doesn't do anything in art history anymore. She tells me, oh, that was another life. But she is the head of EJI in Illinois, which is a very good higher education and prison program. And of course, there's a lot of people in literature and writing, PEN America, and then Shakespeare Behind Bars, so a lot of theater folks. And I have been collaborating with people in theater for a few years, and also I'm also a Weltian. I read about Eudora Welty. That's how I actually got into sideshow banners, was from her photographs of sideshow banners. So I've been with a lot of lit people for a long time too. And I think maybe it's from being with some of these folks who were also doing this work. Oddly enough, I mentioned reacting to the past. And I went to a Reacting to the Past conference, and there was a woman there from political science who was using Reacting to the Past and teaching in a prison, and they did a session. So now you can pretty much, most years at any conference, find a panel about higher education in prison and what people are doing. And one of my other inspirations for starting the program at UCF was I was at SAMLA, the South Atlantic Modern Language Association conference in Atlanta. And somebody projected an image of a drawing my student did, a self-portrait in the prison in Alabama. And I was like, oh my gosh, where did you even get that? And he's like, oh, Kai's, who started the program, APAP in Alabama. So how does it connect to my scholarship? I don't know. Well, I did curate an exhibition of artwork made by people who engage with mass incarceration. And I would say generally as well, all of my scholarship is, I've always been interested in how art either participates or challenges these kind of stereotypical representations of the other writ large, right? But also in how, I also work on community engaged art and socially engaged artistic practice and kind of art as activism, which I think came out of my interest in the 30s, right? Because you have a lot of artists who are making socially engaged artwork, right? And I think that working in the prisons, I mean, that's very socially engaged, but it's also about the power of art to change people's lives, right? And maybe I like art that does something beyond being beautiful or aesthetic qualities. Right. I'm interested in art that makes the world better and that fights for it, and the people who are fighting to make the world better. So that's what inspires me.
Incredibly well put. David, do you have any questions? Any follow-up thoughts?
I think that Dr. Watson has left us with a beautiful thought. I'm interested in art that makes the world better, makes the world a better place. And we thank you, Dr. Watson, for this fascinating talk and this new perspective on Dalí's Dream of Venus from so many productive theoretical and critical perspectives, and in the larger context of eugenics and masculine anxiety and all the other frames that you put around that work. We really learned a lot from you, and we also so appreciated your engagement with the questions following the talk. So we're sorry you couldn't be with us in person, but we've enjoyed having virtually with us 5 terrific speakers over the course of this series, and yours is a great way to close out the spring semester slate of talks. I know that the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee joined me in thanking you and everybody who worked to make this happen. And we look forward to staying connected with you and following your work in the future, and to seeing your textbook when it's published and using it. So this is just, we hope, the beginning of a relationship that will continue.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful time. It was wonderful to be able to share, and thank you for all the really insightful questions. I'm supposed to be working on a version of this for an article, so you gave me so much that I needed. So I really appreciate that. That's the beauty of it, right? Is to get to share and to get to learn from one another. So yes, I can't wait to come to Kansas. So thank you guys. Really, it was really a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Okay, thank you.